Hey, are you hiring? If you answered yes, let XenTegra Staffing help staff your IT people needs. Head over to XenTegra.com/XenTegra Staffing to find out more. XenTegra Staffing, we can staff your IT people needs. Welcome to another edition of the Citrix Session with your hosts, Andy Whiteside and Bill Sutton, your source for all things Citrix.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 58 of the Citrix Session. I'm your host, Andy Whiteside. I got a good group with me today, and we were just going off just now about the topics and random topics, and I kept yelling at the group to not do that till we hit the record button, because we want you guys to hear all these things we're talking about and these things we're sharing together. So I'm kind of probably in the doghouse. Everybody's probably mad at me for acting like that, but it's good stuff, and I want to make sure we get that on the recording onto the cloud or the clouds, which we were just talking about. But let me do the intros real quick. So, of course, Bill's with me. Bill Sutton, Director of Services at XenTegra. Bill, how's it going?
Going well, Andy. Happy New Year to you.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I hope you had a good set of holidays. I assume we've talked between now and Christmas. It's odd when you have the two holidays back to back and they're both 3-day weekends. I joked around with my wife, at least 2020 gave us 2 3-day weekends at the end of the year. That was pretty nice of it.
It sure was. Yep.
We have with us Ben Rogers, who's the sales engineer locally here in the Carolinas. Ben, how's it going? How's your holidays?
Holidays were good, Andy. Happy New Year to everybody, and glad to be back for 2021, ready to hit the ground running.
Yeah, I'm excited. Again, having those 3-day weekends was tough for me because I like to work, and I got a couple things I really just got to get fixed, and I couldn't fix them during the holidays. So that's why I was up all night trying to figure out the right words to say to fix some things I got to fix. But and with us, we have Kevin Nardone. Kevin is a good friend of XenTegra's, has been for many years. Kevin used to run around doing App DNA workshops with us. Kevin, how was your holiday?
It was good. I like the double 3-day weekend. It made me have to kick some dust off. I took some time for Christmas as well beyond the 3-day weekend. So I felt like today is a lot of kicking the dust off and starting up a new year. But it was relaxing. I feel recharged, which is always a good feeling to have.
Well, don't worry. By Tuesday, you'll feel like it never ended. It never stopped.
Exactly. Going, wait a second. But it was fun. We had some really nice weather down here too. We did like a 30-mile bike ride yesterday, my wife and I, and it was good. But I'm ready for 2021. I think this will be a good year.
No. Hey, so before we jump into your part 3 of your series on enterprise scale landing zones as it relates to Citrix and Microsoft Azure, and in fact, the title is Citrix Tips, Citrix on Azure Enterprise Scale Landing Zones Part 3. Let's go back to the conversation we were having before we hit the record button, which is today we have an event happening in our IT space, which is Slack appears to be down. First time I've seen it down. Personally, we use it a decent amount, but it's down. So software as a service does go down. I'm sure they're doing everything they can to prevent that and to get it back up. But that led us into a conversation of cloud versus clouds and digital workspace, which, of course, Citrix would love for you to land on. Citrix workspace as the digital workspace of choice and potentially the only one that you actually look at on a daily basis. But the truth of that is it's probably going to end up being digital workspaces to some degree, unless it just happens to unfold for a customer or they kind of mandate it. Let's revisit what you guys were talking about. Ben, you were kind of going all in on talking about the conversation around Slack being down, digital workspaces. Can you bring that back to the surface?
Yeah, what I was kind of wondering about, I come from an on-prem environment. So, getting employed by Citrix and getting, kind of thrown into this cloud environment, it's swimming in the deep end. And I feel like I've got my head above water, but there are some concepts that I, still am trying to figure out. So one of the things that I was questioning is, you were talking about clouds, and basically you're not in one cloud, you're in multiple clouds. And then you take that from a regional perspective and you go, okay, I might want clients to land in a certain, data center in a certain region. And it seems like that they now have the ability to even extend that into, the local environment, so that, for example, you could have your platform running on Azure, but you could have some Azure deployed within your local sites. And so it would, kind of be a neat infrastructure if you had a San Francisco office that had some local on-prem Azure in its San Francisco office, but it was also being backed by a regional West Coast Azure facility, but also have that on the East Coast, like in an Atlanta area. Have an Atlanta office with an Atlanta on-prem presence, but then also have a hub in the Atlanta metro that you could also lean on in Azure. So that's what I'm reading into some of this and where some of this is going. But I don't know if I'm right because I know enough of it to be dangerous. So I've got the expert in front of me. So that's what I wanted to pose out there when you pose the question of clouds.
Yeah, so let me address that real quick because I think a lot about this. You have clouds, not cloud, and the clouds should talk to the edge, which could be these data centers that you're referring to. And if you're able to pull that off, there's a high probability that you can have redundancy no matter what happens. Throw in a little TCP and most importantly IP and network routing protocols, and you got a chance between the cloud and the services delivered from clouds, as well as potentially your own private data center participating in that as well. And that's your best chance to survive whatever it is you have to survive. I guess Kevin and Bill, do you guys want to chime in on some of that, or are we going to cover it in the review of the blog and that's where we should go next?
Yeah. It's funny. Yeah. It's funny that you mentioned Andy too, because especially like thinking at like part 3, right? A lot of, what I end up focusing on there is really around, continuity, governance, and like what can you do to automate some of that? So like the first topic is actually business continuity. So it's funny that we kind of start the podcast with, Slack having an outage today, because even on the Azure side, one of the first things you really want to think about, whether it be clouds, on-prem, multi-cloud, you always want to make sure you're kind of following the best practices of the cloud provider that you're working with. So like on the Azure side, a lot of customers, initial progress might be an initial Azure region where, hey, we have our data center in, Alpharetta, and we want to have like our first Azure presence being, US East to like drive business continuity. As eventually when you start getting successful, what about your Azure continuity? For example, potentially having a multi-region model or ensuring that you're following things like availability zones. So I think a lot of what Ben mentioned around, the world being multi-cloud, and what you mentioned, Andy, around workspaces. One of the things is you want to make sure that, whatever vendor you're working with, Azure in this instance, you're like following what their best practices are in terms of like, what can we do to make sure we maximize the availability and resiliency of the underlying platform we're going to use for our infrastructure.
Yeah, so maybe, yes, follow what they're giving for their guidance on, and it's really important that we do this. We point out there's a difference between business continuity and disaster recovery. So many people I talk to lump those two things together way too often. I think in this situation with Slack at the moment, it's probably a disaster recovery scenario, and people are having to invoke their own business continuity. Like Ben was saying, his team is now using Teams. Some of them, they were already using it, but some of them are now participating in teams that usually don't. That's the business continuity piece of it, is to have 2 digital workspaces. But yeah, it's the idea that you follow what they say, but then you don't just blindly follow it. You're not just sheep, right? You're adding your own elements of ways to work around it. I'm pretty certain Slack wouldn't tell you that your business continuity plan should be to also use Teams. However, from the end user's perspective, it makes complete sense, since you already have Teams up and going as part of your Office 365, to have that be part of your business continuity plan.
Yeah, like I think this gets into some of what you said about workspaces too, Andy, about having like multiple workspaces, and everyone's goal, Citrix, otherwise, let's consolidate as much point solutions as possible, and that kind of gets into like the concept of like incremental progress, right? Like, sure, the vision is I'm going to put every single thing I own into like one consolidated, pane of glass for an end user. That's well, is that ever achievable? Who knows, especially considering the dynamic nature of technology. But if, for example, you have like 10 different things you're working with, Teams, Slack, email, how you get access to your web apps, your virtual apps, your on-prem apps, your cloud apps, it could be like 10 different things. If 10 doesn't make it to 1, but say 10 goes to like 3 or 4, that's still probably great sets of, improved simplicity for somebody. So I like what you mentioned with, multiple workspaces, having that resiliency, not in just technology, but also like end user workflow. That if, hey, I have something wrong, like if I can't access my email, like I'm going to text somebody or I'm going to, make a quick phone call if suddenly my email's down. So like having like resiliency and workflows as well to kind of continue to maintain the business, it kind of does get into that, multiple, workspace approach, and even just like the concept of trying to really understand how users work as you look towards workspace, not just on like where you need to land like infrastructure with public cloud.
So I have one comment on this, right? So I don't think it's a matter of getting down to a single or two or even three, maybe digital workspaces. I think it's a matter of trying to focus and get to one great aggregator of all those workspaces. For me right now, that's email. Yeah. You send me something in Teams, you send me something in Slack, you send me something on Podio. I'm going to get it in email, and that's my aggregator. But the future of this, and this is where maybe Citrix has a great vision, is to aggregate those things into one workspace. And as long as that one's up, you have what you need. And when that one's not up, you can go directly to the other ones or fall back to a third one, which might be email at that point. So now you've got two great aggregators, the digital workspace from Citrix, so Citrix Workspace with Intelligence, plus your email in case that one's not up. What do you guys think about that as like a real strategy that might be accomplishable?
No, I think that's a really good strategy, quite frankly. And I think IT, corporate IT can set the standard for that. But I think at the end of the day, like today in particular, particularly in a smaller business, people are going to find a way to communicate, whether it's, a text or whether it's an email or whether it's even some third-party solution, Facebook Messenger or WhatsApp or whatever. People are going to find a way to communicate if they need to in real time. But having a standard for, hey, this is what happens when the workspace is down. You should go to this method of communication, then go to this method of communication. If all fails, what do? They're going to always fall. People are going to fall back to what they know.
Hey, Bill, you're a guy of a certain age. When you need me and you can't find me on digital workspace, what do you do?
Call you.
Yeah, that ain't going to work much longer, but it does work for us.
Well, this is interesting that we're bringing this up because, for the listeners here, the ones that are doing the administration day to day, I used to do that role for a very long time. These are the kind of conversations that you end up having with the administrators of your business, because these are some tech questions, but these are also business process questions. What do we do if we lose our main communication systems? How do we survive that? And technology always can't give you that answer because your fallback might not work. Like example, you might all go, okay, let's text and let's start calling each other. But what if the outage is cellular? And now the device in your hand no longer works except for what it can do locally. So, I would always get caught behind the eight ball coming into the boardroom with these grand technical plans. And sometimes I would miss the user aspect of it or the human aspect of it. So for the listeners today, the administrators that hear all these grand tech things, a lot of what we're talking about today, man, has to be set down with your administrators and have a plan of, let's say it's apocalyptic and the technology no longer works. What do we do? That needs to be part of the communication plan as well.
Yeah, Ben, you're hitting on something, and that's because of your experience that most tech guys don't really get is the users need to tell you how you're going to do it. You're not telling them how they're going to do it. You're giving them options maybe, but you have to let them help you understand what they need to run the business in that moment in time. All right, so I don't think we're...
And I tell you, though, one other thing on this, if administrators do that, they will drive adoption of their technology. And I think that what everybody here is saying, that will allow the aggregation of processes to be, felt upon the users, not feel like it's being pushed upon them. And so again, talking to your business leaders, figuring out how your users are using this technology will make your journey into making some of these decisions we're going to be talking about easier, because you're doing it for the good of the user base and the business instead of what the technology hot button is today, which always changes.
Hey, Ben, you got kids, right? You have kids, sorry.
Oh, of course, man, kids and grandkids now.
So let me ask you this. In the case of what we're talking about here with business continuity, what about, let's say you're using Teams and Teams is down and some of your users, some of your employees start texting each other and then 5 hours later Teams is back up. But now they've learned they can text each other and you've got to somehow get them back into using Teams. That's one of the hardest things I struggle with because I answer one person's text and now all they do is text me all the time. They never use the determined or desired first level of communication anymore. And I've got to go be the bad guy and tell them not to do that.
That's a hard one, because now you're trying to manipulate people's behavior. And, my boss puts it great, man. The toothpaste is already out of the tube. It's hard to put it back in. So I feel for situations there. Sometimes you got to do the carrot and the stick. This was good while we were down. Now we're back to day-to-day processes. And if you don't go back to the process, then there's a punishment. Hate to be that blunt about it, but sometimes that's what you have to do.
And the entire leadership team has to be on that same page, because if half of them are still texting after the thing down, now it's really hard to put the toothpaste back in.
Yep, exactly right.
I think this gets to a key point, right? And especially whether be Citrix on Azure, Citrix on-prem, workspace, virtualization, new remote working work styles. Technology is always changing. End users, you always want to build something that's going to maximize their productivity. But a lot of what we're talking about really highlights that from a continuity standpoint and just technology adoption, the concept of end user engagement isn't just hey, we're doing a pilot, let us tell you about it. It really does need to be something that's consistent, having maybe monthly lunch and learns with end users. Hey, this is what we've done with technology and how it can be be better for you, and we're going to pull in Janet from HR who's using it day to day, and John from our engineering department who was able to kind of have this great story of how he work flexed with him and his family while on out of while away or at home or something along those lines, making where I see kind of that differentiation between customers that are just getting it out there and it's there but not really being adopted, and then customers who are really just innovating and driving business change. One of the big differentiators is always that end user engagements built into their standard process. Their IT teams are kind of thinking about, okay, when we roll this out, there's certain gates that we need to meet from a user communication and training standpoint, and then we got to make it as part of our consistent monthly, weekly, quarterly cadence. That's kind of where I'm seeing more trends in understanding that aspect of it, Citrix technology or otherwise, is, really ensuring that there's a good line of communication between, you and a line of business or an IT team and potentially an end user, at least in a training and adoption and informational standpoint.
Yeah. Hey, let's jump into the article, which I think we have, but I need to make sure we have. So, Kevin, this is part 3 of your series. In this part, we're really covering, scaling and landing zones. And your first, after the introduction, is business continuity and disaster recovery, which I think we brought up a few minutes ago. Are there any key features? You're going feature by feature, which is awesome. Are there any key features that you want to call out as part of that BC and DR conversation?
Yeah, the way I really organized this was really starting at the macro level, right? Some of the things you need to think about first is what regions make the most sense for your business.
Yep.
So typically that's based on feature availability, location of existing data, et cetera. And so thinking about also are you, single region or multi-regional? You really need to think, I'm seeing, more and more, at least larger organizations, try to think what's geographic redundancy look like, not just for disaster recovery, but also potentially for better user experience, especially if you have dispersed workloads. Now, not everyone's going to need a multi-region approach, right? Especially if you're in a commercial, smaller, small, medium business. We don't need as much as servers infrastructure. That then gets into, how are you connecting into Azure? I know I've talked specifically about ExpressRoute, but definitely recommend for those listening, especially if you're at a smaller shop, some of the site-to-site VPN options and certain SLAs that they may have. Really understand what the service levels are and performance between how you connect your data center to Azure, because that's going to be a critical piece of overall availability of the service. And then kind of get into things like availability zones. Okay, I have my region, I'm connecting my data center. Now, how do I ensure, regional availability? So separate out workloads into different zones within the same region, or availability sets, which is kind of the concept of an anti-affinity group, but within Azure, and kind of then really break it down from there is really kind of the approach I want to take when I put that together.
Hey guys, I'm going to try something here with Ben. Ben, you ready?
Yeah, go ahead, Andy.
Ben,
hello?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I'm back. Sorry, yeah.
You got your softball glove on?
My softball glove on?
Yeah.
Sure.
All right. Well, maybe I'm going to be the one pitching here. We had this conversation last week in front of somebody that I didn't really know. What's the most beautiful thing from a Citrix guy's perspective that allows you to have that secondary zone or region somewhere geographically dispersed if you're using Citrix? What makes that such a beautiful reality?
Well, then you can start, splitting your load. You can actually go, and that was one of the things I thought was interesting about this. You talk about a business continuity strategy. You can also get into an active load strategy. I mean, you now can take your compute centers and distribute them across multiple regions. Now, where this gets a little funny to me, and I think the conversation you're alluding to is our conversation with Digital Realty, is how do you get people to their data? And data is now starting to be centralized, and companies are now starting to think about how do I protect my data, and how do I get my users to my data if my data is not necessarily where the users are. And so I think that's the conversation you're referring to, and I hope I caught your softball pass there.
Well, what's the magical thing Citrix brings to the equation that allows you to have your secondary data and your secondary compute region thousands of miles away, but still have a good user experience?
Oh, the HDX protocol and our ability to, handle those screen scrapes and keyboards, so much better than all the other protocols.
And that's the number one reason why Citrix is still the king of all this, is the longevity and the proven user experience that continues to get better, so that when Kevin Nardone tells you got to put your secondary region somewhere thousands of miles away, he still knows the user are going to have a pretty good experience even connecting to those resources. Right, Kevin?
Yeah, and I one of my customers right now, so in Azure, you have the NV4 series VMs, which are AMD-based GPU machines, right? One of my customers is actually, it wasn't available in the US yet, but we wanted to kind of get a good feel of one of their applications, which is, CATIA, 3D-based app, CAD program, that, hey, let's just start testing in the EU. And one of the guys even said, it's well, this is like a local machine. And he was connecting from, the U.S., going across the Atlantic Ocean to a 3D-backed, instance in Azure, West Europe, for example. And that's just all about the power of the protocol. And one of the cool things, we really make it a lot easier, too, with Citrix Cloud, because that's just drop connectors in a resource location and then, really kind of get going, especially if you have the Azure infrastructure set up.
Right.
So, and, that's one thing that we'll throw a little bit of a sales pitch out here for Citrix. That's the one thing that makes the Citrix platform so powerful, is you not only can do that in Azure, you can do that in any of these cloud environments. So not only can you have multiple regions in one cloud vendor, you can do that across multiple cloud vendors. And more importantly, your administrative staff is looking at one pane of glass, being able to manage all these resources. They're not having to learn a new pane of glass every time they bring on one of these cloud services.
So, Ben, I bring that up to people every once in a while as the nirvana of having resiliency outside of the Citrix Cloud, is to have those multiple IaaS solutions, multiple clouds. I've never had anybody take me up on it, but it does get the Citrix story across when you let them know a desktop can be running in Azure and Google all at the same time, and be in an active scenario where one user's going to Google and one user's going to Microsoft Azure, and in theory they won't even know the difference.
Well, I think it's interesting that you're able to deploy the platform out of the European region versus doing that in America. I mean, that kind of shows you where the technology lean is. And so I think that's interesting that you're having to go outside the United States to get those compute resources for, a U.S.-based company.
Right. All right, so moving forward here, and Bill, I'm sorry, we're kind of this is a good conversation. When you need to chime in, just.
Oh yeah, I'm agreeing with everything. I'm nodding over here. So yeah, I mean, a lot of what they're saying really dovetails into what I've been thinking.
So Kevin, your next section here, still under disaster recovery, business continuity, talks about availability sets. You want to help us understand the difference between regions, availability zones, and availability sets?
Yep. So a region, and kind of thinking of instance types and all that stuff, that's pretty much your geo proximity and what features are available for that specific Azure set of data centers. Now, when you get into a region, it talks really about okay, now what are the configuration settings within my region that I need to think of? So like some regions have a feature known as availability zones, which in reality is just a separate set of data centers. They tend to have you like 20 to 30 miles away from a proximity perspective. So you get data center level resiliency. If there's like a catastrophic data center level failure within one of these Azure regions, you can maintain availability because you've, say, for example, split your cloud connectors between 3 different zones, for example. So you have a cloud connector within each data center. Those data centers have, high performing, low latency connections, and you can maintain uptime. Now, why regions is one of the most important first conversations that you need to have is not every, region is created equal, right? Some get access to features earlier, like that one instance I mentioned where in Europe, they actually had, availability of that GPU series backed instance before it came to the US region that customer was using. Availability zones kind of have a similar concept. Well, that's how it has more broad adoption within Azure today. The previous form factor of that was availability sets, where you have some of the smaller regions where it's singular data center, and you want to make sure that your components are isolated from one another from a hardware perspective. So, for example, I don't want to be on the same set of storage, compute power with my storefront server or critical application database as like the N+1 set of those components. So typically, you're only doing one or the other. And the goal is you really want to lead with availability zones if they're available in your Azure region, because that provides a higher SLA of 99.99 versus availability sets for one of those components, it would be 99.95. So it's just kind of similar features, similar concept. If I want to make sure my VMs are resilient, zones just give data center level resiliency versus just like hardware resiliency, which is what availability sets do.
Yeah, cool. All right, the next section of this is managed disk. How does that apply to the business continuity and disaster recovery conversation?
So thinking of your region, where am I putting my infrastructure, availability zones, availability sets, how am I making sure my infrastructure is resilient? What you need to think of next is, okay, I want to make sure my workloads are highly available. Now, one of the differences, especially when you think of an infrastructure server, I, as an end user, I might be connecting and like getting my authentication from one, but it's not really where I'm doing my work, right? Where my session is existing. It's not my VDI where I'm going to be spending, most of my time, where I'm tied to that single VM while I work. So like managed disks, are not, from a performance perspective, not all are created equal, and that's obvious. But one of the things that I keep in mind from availability standpoint is the single VM SLA is not created equal. So for example, if I have a VDI, it's my desktop. If I'm on a premium SSD, I'm going to have a higher availability rating for that VDA. So like from a customer standpoint, if you're planning and you have a use case that's, hey, it doesn't need a lot of performance, but it's critical to the business, it might be worth considering using, better tiered storage because Microsoft has a higher SLA that's applied to that individual VM. Because the one thing with an availability zone or availability set, that SLA is tied to the availability of like that, say tier of your infrastructure. So like, hey, my cloud connectors, I could have these cloud connectors as 90.9.99 availability per Microsoft's SLA, but that's not like the availability of like a user's VDI or like the SAP server that they're connecting to get, published virtualized version of SAP. So again, like kind of starting at the macro level with the region, working into how you want to really set up your infrastructure into more of like the workloads and ways to make those more available.
Ben, Bill, any questions, comments, thoughts?
Does this follows the availability? This works right into availability sets and availability zones, right? These follow them, right, Kevin?
Yeah, this would be like how you would think about your like workloads themselves. So like say, for example, my cloud connectors or storefront or ADCs, I would throw in availability zones and availability sets. But then when I'm provisioning, say, my VDAs with machine creation services, I need to pick a storage that I'm going to use. Right. One of the things that you want to think about is not just performance, but the availability of that storage for a single VM. Mm-hmm. So like that single VM, if it's on Ultra or Premium SSD, Microsoft rates it with a 99.9 SLA from an uptime standpoint.
Yeah, I think a lot of customers look at it strictly from the performance perspective and perhaps don't consider the SLAs. At least that's been my experience.
Yes. Yeah. Now, again, that's also one of those things too. It's like, hey, well, what is like 99.5 for us? If we're going to end up spending, 30, 50% more on storage, like, do we really need that 0.5 for this use case? And one of the cool things with MCS, and this kind of gets into some of the previous blogs and creating like a, tiered services model. It's where like, hey, you know what? We have like our help desk, team leads or like, our managers, we can take the same master image and we can give it to create, two different service tiers where like this line of business, you know what? They're more cost conscious and we know that like their output is not as business critical. Let's give them the same image on, a lower performing instance type and a lower performing storage to conserve costs. But then suddenly, our, help or support contact center who's dealing with, they're down for a minute and we lose like thousands of dollars. Like they don't need the performance, but they need the availability. Like let's give them the best types from the same master image, assuming like that has the same components. So that's kind of where like planning out your sizing and kind of aligning, who's more cost conscious with who's more performance and availability conscious, you can have that level of flexibility.
I see.
We kind of talk a little bit of that too as we go through this blog in terms of like automation around that and desired state config and everything, but we can kind of save that for when we work towards that.
So I think this goes back to what we were talking about before. You can get some of these business continuities to actually be performance enhancers. So in this case, you talk about, you got a set of stockbrokers and they need their machines to be, they might not need the fastest performing machines, but they need their machines up. So you would obviously bring them into this ultra SSD. So again, administrators, as you're looking at implementing some of this, look at maybe, not only looking at performance enhancements, but also business continuity enhancements that'll get you both two birds with one stone.
All right, let's go to the conversation around backup. And I'm curious to see how this applies to the Citrix workloads, or is this just a general conversation around making sure you have key components and key data backed up, Kevin?
Yep. Yeah, this gets into, so for example, I can have my machine up and running, and this, I'll tie it to like resource locks too. I can have my machines up and running, but say, for example, if someone, fat fingers a bad config that's like replicated out to it, or someone's persistent desktop gets corrupted, backup from a Citrix perspective, especially when like a lot of workloads may be non-persistent, kind of really only applies to a subset of the overall architecture, like your infrastructure, your master image VMs that you're using for, machine management and things along those lines, and user persistent desktops. So that's something where Azure Backup, built-in service on the Microsoft side, where you can set those types of retention policies. So say, for example, someone makes a change to a storefront server, they follow change control and things along those lines, but maybe something unexpected, or they're doing it manually, so they maybe select the wrong thing because there's always human error. And then you replicate that change out, for example, to 2 storefront servers, and now you're down, right? It doesn't matter how many you had, those changes have been replicated. That's kind of where having a backup of critical infrastructure is important. One for like rollback from a change standpoint, or if there's like some form of like corruption that's replicated out, right? So this is kind of more making awareness that feature is available on the Azure side, because a lot of folks may have backup solutions in place today on-prem. Okay, we need to make sure we back up. Do we set up a third-party solution from the marketplace, or we use the native features? And where does it apply from a Citrix standpoint? Something to really think about. And that kind of gets into resource locks as well. What if someone accidentally deletes something, or maybe you don't want someone to have the ability to power manage infrastructure, so you set it to read only. Like resource locks are another way to kind of prevent from that human error side of things when it comes to like administering an environment.
Yeah, Kevin, I'm really loving this blog. There's so many basic concepts that you touch on, at least briefly here, that you kind of start to clarify things that I wasn't really sure about. And I'm going to date myself here. While we're doing this, I'm over on Amazon looking for the latest, greatest Azure book that covers a lot of these conversations, which I'll probably buy and sit on my desk and never open. But it's time. It's time for me. My team, of course, has, but it's time for me to hopefully, now that Azure is kind of settled down a little bit, start to really own up some more on some of these concepts.
I would echo that. This is definitely something that I'm sorry. I was going to say, I was going to echo what you just said, Andy. This concept of resource locks. Backups, obviously, you had some knowledge of that, but resource locks and then some of the security governance and compliance stuff that we're going to cover shortly is I'm learning, just like we do a lot on a lot of these blogs, I'm learning some things I didn't really even know were out there. So it emphasizes the need for me to get more up to speed on this stuff as well. So it's definitely a really good blog.
All right. So, Kevin, that gets us down to the next section, which is security, governance, and compliance. Similar type thing here. Let's talk through what you're covering for the listeners.
Yeah, this is one I would have loved to do, probably like a dedicated blog just to this topic, because I do feel like I only really scratched the surface. Because like when you think of like security in an Azure framework standpoint, you have like some of the capabilities of Azure Security Center around like automated reporting and monitoring when it comes to like compliance, key rules, recommended configurations from a security best practices standpoint, as well as ways to like automate actions against that. Then you also have the concept of Azure policy, where there's governance needs that I need within my organization around tagging, around what SKUs we should use, around, disabling or preventing, enablement of certain features. Like, hey, I don't want a public IP on anything. And I've seen, for example, if you go through the default wizard of creating a VM in Azure, it'll ask you, do you want a public IP? And I've seen, customers before, especially if they're not as familiar with Azure, go about create a master machine that they're working with. It has a public IP attached to it. And then suddenly Security Center is saying, hey, you know what? There was 100 attempts to brute force enter this VM via RDP. Why do you have a public IP against this? So governance, and Azure policy is a great way to kind of, prevent against certain aspects of human error and really make sure your environment complies with what your cloud platform team wants to do, as well as kind of make things easier from a Citrix standpoint when it comes to, hey, I'm going through machine creation services. I've reserved F-Series VMs. Maybe I'm a new admin. Maybe I don't remember that. And suddenly I start provisioning stuff with D-Series. And now I'm leaving money on the table when it comes to, price performance of my Citrix environment. So Azure policy to me, all the Security Center stuff, something very good to be aware of that exists. And oftentimes a platform team would be managing something like that. But at least one of the key takeaways for this blog, Azure policy is a great tool that I really think every, Citrix admin who's doing something on Azure should be aware of, that it exists, and how to set it up and use it, and what it entails. Because on the Citrix side, there's really a lot of great ways to prevent, people from, making mistakes, or at least kind of drive consistency in the environment. And there's also ways too to kind of build off of current Citrix, capabilities with Azure capabilities. For example, appending resources that you provision with MCS to get, a policy, or making sure all of your persistent VMs have backup enabled so that, a user, if they have corruption, they're not losing work, for example. So Azure policy is a great way to do that.
Guys, I'm
kind of given a couple examples.
I do want to get Ben and Bill's comments on this. I think this is interesting, this whole ability to do these workloads in Azure, because historically, if I'm the Citrix admin, there's a group of guys on the other side of the wall that own the data-centered hardware that I can't get access to. Now, if I'm the Citrix admin, at the very least, I can spin up my own personal lab in Azure that matches, for the most part, the Azure environment the company's using, and I can now start to do these things. And I'm not, the bad news is I got to know a lot more than I used to have to know, but now I'm not precluded from having access to it like maybe I would have been at some point in my career. So I don't know whether
the whole concept of Azure Yeah. Yeah, the whole concept of Azure policy too, just like GPOs, right? Thinking of, for example, hey, I have a higher level OU that someone's applying, a security policy to, and then all my machines inherited at the lower levels. Azure policy works in a similar way. For example, you have your subscriptions or your management group that, is the entire enterprise, and we're going to be applying, certain aspects of compliance to all of our machines within, Azure proper across, all of, XenTegra Cloud, right? And then you have, for example, a subscription that is like Citrix or your Citrix landing zone specifically, assuming you have the permissions from an admin side, you can apply the lower level policies that then kind of build off of what's inherited at a higher level. So similar concepts too, as you kind of start unpacking the capability of Azure policy that like really takes like the concept of group policy, but then like applies it at like an infrastructure level where you're controlling machine level configurations of how have you provisioned this, like what attributes you're giving that machine, what features are being turned on with that machine at the Azure platform level, and then just automating its application.
Yeah, we've seen this. I've seen this used both in simple, small environments where they've done things like the first one you listed here in the blog, the allow virtual machine SKUs, to try to prevent them from spinning up machines that weren't part of reserved instances. And then I've also seen it where they've had multiple subscriptions and have leveraged the policies across the subscriptions to do similar things, such as not allow the Citrix admins to spin up machines in the shared services environment, but they let them spin up Citrix machines in the Citrix environment, but not those that are not reserved instances. So I've seen it, and I've seen the Wild Wild West as well, of course.
So Kevin, I have a question for you. Seeing this in the wild, do you have the potential to have policy duplication like you do in group policy management? I mean, I tried to, I hope Andy would back me up on this. I tried to run a very healthy environment in all the places that I managed. But at the end of the day, you would go in there and find things where you're like, okay, Joe was in here testing and he never got rid of this, and now this is being applied. I mean, do they make it easier to stop those pitfalls, or kind of give us an idea, the real world in the wild, how this is managed? And, is it group policy management all over again in Azure, or just for somebody that hasn't seen this before?
Yeah, it's not like, at least from what I've seen, like typically you're not doing like hundreds or thousands of policies that you may see in a group policy sense, but it does do a good job of, overall summarizing compliance across, across your overall environment, and kind of summarizing outputs of those policies and like what resources are compliant versus non-compliant. But typically what I've seen is that you're talking, 15, 20 policies, not, 200, 300,000 of them. But it kind of really depends. But it does the dashboard does a really good job of like summarizing it. And like one of the things that's a little like much different here is it's kind of applied at like a resource level, right? So like when you define a policy and then you also assign it, but that like definition may apply, say, for example, to, Azure storage and like the storage, APIs, for example, like, hey, storage accounts need to have like these types of parameters, or for example, your like security center or like your key vault. So there is a little bit more complexity, right? Where you're not just applying like one type of configuration only to like Windows-based machines. Like you could define certain aspects based on like the resource that you're managing. So I know like a lot to unpack there, but it kind of really depends. But that was like just one comparison in terms of like inheritance, but it is like very much a completely different set of concepts.
So to me, it sounds like you're describing. It sounds like you're describing like environmental management now instead of just machine and user management.
It's like desired state. Yeah, it's like desired state configuration. I guess like group policy, like in terms of like just the hierarchy, like just kind of the best metaphor I could think of is like how, OUs, you'd have like an OU and sub OU, just like you could have like management groups and like management groups within management groups and like subscriptions, and how Azure policies would be applied, say, at a higher level and then inherited as you go down, and where you can also then make exceptions, say, on the Citrix side, if it's like a lower level management group. But that's kind of really where the comparisons, that's probably the only comparison that I could think of. The rest of it, completely different. Very much like data center and resource management versus like user configuration management, for example.
So guys, we only have a few minutes left, and I do want to cover this last section, even though it scares me to even talk about it. But platform automation and DevOps, those aren't things, at least the DevOps piece, Kevin, that people on the Citrix admin side of the world typically have their head wrapped around. Let's walk through this portion of the blog and let's try to explain what you're covering here.
Yeah, so the reason I wanted to really highlight this too, and I do see a larger trend, and some of this might be, in the like a larger business enterprise, business specific, where you have like a lot of like platform teams or like, server and OS teams, like a Citrix team is starting to move towards Azure. And then it's like, hey, you need to, the way we're building machines, like it needs to comply with this new like DevOps, pipeline. You need to now like adhere to this and kind of shift away from your process. So like one of Microsoft's recommendations is like, don't force app teams to use that central process if it doesn't really jive with it, right? So like thinking of like what is Citrix in the context of Azure, like Citrix overall is an app that like delivers apps, right? So when it like really the main piece I'm trying to get aside is, if a organization has the concept of like an OS build pipeline where they automate the creation of a machine, there are ways to use that process that makes the best advantage of like Citrix technology without having to completely rewrite how you're provisioning your VDAs. And that's like really by taking that concept of, I have a blueprint for building, say, a Windows 10 machine. Don't like have every single machine you build have that blueprint run against it. Run it against one machine and then extrapolate that single machine out using machine creation services. Yeah, this is a lot of new concepts. I think this is probably the newest compared to on-prem. One of the biggest changes that I'm seeing is like really looking towards like a lot more desired state config, like whether it be Puppet, Chef, Ansible, et cetera. A lot of organizations want to leverage some of those tools or leverage some of the things that Microsoft has built in, like Azure automation, around doing desired state config against multiple machines. And like to me, especially if they don't understand Citrix, you get into a scenario where an environment can be horribly over-engineered. Like, okay, I'm going to provision 1,000 VMs by spinning up 1,000 VMs and then running a configuration job against it to configure all these settings and deploy all these applications against 1,000 machines. Well, if you do that 1,000 times, even if you fail at only like 1% or half of a percentage, you're still troubleshooting 50 machines because something broke. So your blast radius is very large. That can add complexity. Why not, if you want to control the configuration, that standard of how a machine is built, whether it's security settings, what are the features, what are the agents are all there. Do it against a single machine and then scale that out with MCS. And that I think has actually resonated a lot well with teams because you can adapt to the platform standards that are being established by like a client OS or server OS team. That's like a segment of an Azure team to like what's the best way to use those processes with Citrix capabilities.
And Kevin, I can't imagine anybody who grew up on PVS and then MCS would begin to do it any other way. But are you seeing people that try to deploy things through Azure and then configure them?
So I see teams like for example, if like an Azure team is adapting Citrix for the first time, being like, no, like this is how we build every single server. Like I don't care if you're delivering like an SAP client or like a Office 365 from that server. Like this is our standard of how that machine needs to be built and maintained. Like I see this is kind of more of the reason I really built this section and kind of focused on this topic is more to like equip Citrix teams to like have those conversations with a cloud platform team and understand like, hey, this is what is the best fit based on like your current methodology you may be using. So for example, I have one of my customers on the financial side is like, hey, every time we do a Windows update, we are going to be wiping that machine, running a desired state config, and then really building from scratch like it's a cattle. It's like, wait a second, like you can't do that with cloud connectors. Like the technology or storefront servers isn't really, you don't want to be like reinstalling and reconfiguring storefront from scratch like every month because like a new patch came out. It's really kind of more of like enabling that, hey, these are concepts that people are exploring in cloud workloads that are not Citrix and kind of more of the Windows level. Now, this is how you can translate and have that conversation so that you can align with certain processes that maximize these new technology capabilities around automation without like throwing your Citrix environment off the rails.
Yeah. Yeah, this is when you really just have to stand up and realize that the simplest way to do it is the best way to do it, no matter what.
Exactly.
Which is quite often with engineers, they really like to flip the switches especially the ones they already know, even if they're not the right switches. Ben, Bill, thoughts on this?
So I kind of see this, kind of relate this a little bit to the days of going into an environment where they are very heavy system center oriented and they build all their machines using system center, including their desktops, and they want to shoehorn that into leveraging it for building the Citrix workloads. And while you can use it to build a master, you probably don't want them building individual VMs and then basically making them standalones. You want them to build a master and then leverage that master via MCS or PVS, depending on what you're doing on-prem, for spinning up the Citrix workloads and make it part of that process. Doesn't mean the SCM process goes away. It's just treated differently. I kind of see this the same way. Would you agree, Kevin, or am I off base here?
Yeah, it's exactly like same concept. Like, hey, we're going to build everything from SCCM, and like that's how it needs to be done for every single machine. We had the biggest concept, and this is kind of even like, straight from the cloud adoption framework on the Microsoft side. Don't force application teams to use a central or provisioning pipeline if they have a process that's already in place. And that's kind of where it also gets into Azure policy and some of the benefits there. That if, I'm like building these machines and they might be getting generated a little bit differently than how maybe the platform team is doing it. Don't like disorganize the app team, in this case Citrix, to adhere to this new process, especially if they have tools that work really well and they're simple. Use Azure policy to create those guardrails. So this kind of ties back to that security and compliance, and why Citrix teams really should understand Azure policy and how it works, because like that's also a tool that if you have a very inflexible platform team, hey, this is what's needed on the Citrix side. This is how we can potentially adapt to, that quote unquote OS build pipeline. And this is how we can also, conform to your existing standards using Azure policy.
Guys, we're out of time. Kevin, up next, what's going to be in part 4?
Yep. So it was funny, right? When I was writing this, and I really tried to stay in the order of how Microsoft was laying out each of these critical design areas. And as I was putting this one together, the networking and monitoring and really trying to get all these concepts into a single blog, I felt was impossible. So I really wanted to split out networking and monitoring into its really own blog as the conclusion of the series, because networking tends to be also where most of the challenges come in. If you have an overcomplicated Azure network, it could really impact your success, or if you didn't plan your networking properly. So I really wanted to have that into its own blog and take some time to get through the end of the year and start fresh to really focus on it. So really it's going to be closing this off and doubling back to the critical design area of networking and monitoring to kind of really break down this is what an ideal Citrix on Azure network looks like, and really give some references around here's some tools to be aware of from a monitoring perspective when it comes to that network, some concepts you want to be familiar with, and here's an example of what a Citrix and an Azure network you can use as maybe a starting reference point, for example.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. I'm looking forward to it. I'm kind of speechless. There's so much we covered here, but extremely valuable. I ordered 2 books while we were on this podcast, and I'm going to try to make myself read those in the first quarter of this year. It's clear that I need to run back through and make sure I understand Azure much deeper, and then how it would apply into a Citrix EUC type of solution. Ben, let me bring it over to you. Thoughts as we adjourn here?
Well, I started out the conversation saying this with the microphone off, so I'll repeat it with the microphone on. Kevin, I think this blog series is awesome. As an old administrator, this would be something that would help me kind of start to understand what my migration from on-prem to cloud would be. You got lots of good nuggets, especially looking at the foundation and stuff that Azure lays out. Man, you give a good story of how you can start from on-prem and move into Azure, and then you just continue the story out. So the same as everybody on the call, I've got lots of reading to do, but as a Citrix employee, I thank you for doing this, because it makes my job easier, because I've got information that I can pass to my customers to make their transition easier. And then also thank you for being an old administrator for writing this, because a lot of administrators sit out there and they don't really know where to start. And these documents and these blogs gives a place for these people to start. And as Andy is saying, you can go buy the books, but I also think you can dig into these blogs and read these links, like I'm reading this backup link you included and how they're doing SQL backups. And so you really can come up to speed very quick with this information. So I thank you as an employee, but also as an old administrator.
Thanks, Ben. I appreciate that. Yeah, I'm hoping that this will kind of inspire a nice refresh of the current reference architecture to kind of like tie these similar concepts and continue to build on them. And we'll see. 2021 is just getting started. We'll see where it goes.
Hey, Bill, anything else before we wrap up here?
No, I would thank Kevin as well, and I'm really looking forward to the networking pieces. I've been working on a project with a customer that's had a rather complex Azure networking environment, and I've learned a lot, but there's a lot to learn in that subject. So I'm looking forward about.
Oh yeah,
that's good. I'm sure you've been spending a lot of time on that.
Yeah, I think I learned something new about Azure networking like every week. There's a lot to it.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not going to lie. That next part 4, I'm already intimidated by, and Kevin hadn't even written it yet. But we'll get it on here. We'll cover it. So, guys, I appreciate your time today. Happy New Year, and look forward to working together more in 2021.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me as always, Andy.
Thanks, Andy.
Happy New Year, everybody.
Thank you for listening to the Citrix Session with your hosts, Andy Whiteside and Bill Sutton. A special thanks to our guest for attending today's podcast produced by Pete Downing. For any input, or if you'd like to be a part of our podcast, please email us at info@XenTegra.com. Please head over to XenTegra.com/podcast to listen to all podcasts in this series. This podcast is copyrighted by XenTegra LLC.